it was, yeah, acoustically, it was quite nice actually. But there you go. So I didn't sing out loud myself because I didn't want to ruin it. Yeah, have a habit of doing that. Somebody was asking me earlier whether I'm preaching this evening, and I said, well, not really, because this isn't quite preaching. This is an opportunity for us to basically just spend a bit of time as we're going through the books of the Bible. And it does mean that as I'm giving an overview to the Bible, we're condensing quite a lot of information into a small space. So some of it I'll go through quite quickly, but then also, as you all know, I quite like to zoom in on a particular issue. And then I always ask the question, do you think this is important? And everyone goes, no, I don't know why we're talking about this. Every single week, and I think you'll probably say the same thing this week. But nevertheless, I quite enjoy picking out these slightly more controversial or debatable or whatever. Are you okay? Oh, you've already done it. Brilliant. This is Tom. Tom is secretly making sure that everything is running correctly in the background there. But so this evening we're looking at Romans, and actually I kind of like put off Romans. We probably should have done it about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but it's such a big letter that he wrote, and so we thought it would be quite good to tackle some of the smaller letters. So it means we've gone a little bit out of sequence, but not too much. We do know that Romans was written by Paul, and it's one of the most longest and significant letters which Paul has written, and it really gives us something of Paul's theology, his love for the gospel, and it's actually an amazing letter to be able to use to get a real sort of like coherent account of the gospel message. And the actual context of the letter is really quite interesting, because it's believed that the church in Rome, it had existed for quite some time before this letter had been written by Paul to the churches there, and it was believed to have been written to several churches. And it was a diverse community, and it was clearly made up of Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus. However, as was indicated in Acts chapter 18, it's believed that the letter was written to the Romans after a period where the Jewish people had been expelled from Rome. And then they were actually coming back to the Roman church, where they were then coming in and dealing with the fact that the church had grown in certain ways whilst they weren't there, and that they were sort of like calling into question some of the practices. Where does the authority lay within the church? It says in Acts chapter 18, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Claudius, he was the emperor at the time, and he was the uncle of the previous emperor Gaius Caligula, who we'd actually come across when we were looking at the letter of Thessalonians, because it was that emperor that had ordered that an image of himself should be erected in the Jewish temple. Do you remember? But he was actually assassinated before that came to be. Well, it was his uncle, Claudius, who basically came and succeeded Caligula. Really helpful names to try to remember. And he was quite interesting, actually, Claudius, because he was described as physically unattractive. He walked with a limp, and he had a slight deafness. And it suggested that probably saved him from the fate of many of the nobles around that time of basically being killed in his life. And so when it came to the point of deciding who would succeed Gaius Caligula, it seemed to be he was one of the only emperors who was remaining. And you can imagine that they probably weren't expecting much of him, but it actually turned out to be that he was a very efficient administrator. he had a very keen mind. And it was actually during his time as emperor that he successfully started the conquest of Britain. So this here is a bronze head of Claudius, which was found in the River Ade in Suffolk. And so I just thought that was really interesting, because there's a real sort of like connection there to how the Romans spread into the UK, and then of course Christianity followed with that as well. Many scholars believe that he was eventually murdered, as seemed to be the fate of a lot of the emperors, by his own wife, whose son, and it would have been his stepson, Nero, succeeded him as the emperor. Well, it was Caladius, who had commanded that all of the Jewish people in Rome were to basically be expelled. And so you can imagine that here this letter is written after this period when the Romans are returning back to the church. But the church didn't just cease to exist. It seems to be that the Gentiles basically made the church their home, and you can imagine that it meant that they began to have different practices and so on, that as the Jewish people came to start returning to this church, were then questioning. And I can imagine it created a lot of tension as well when we were thinking about who's holding the authority at the time. There were definitely clashes between these returning Jews and the existing Gentiles, and they were particularly accused of failing to follow the appropriate customs. It was written around 50 to 60 AD, the letter, most likely they believe around 57 AD, and it can be fairly accurately placed because of the different events which have been described, and it was very likely written from Corinth on Paul's third missionary journey, and that's indicated in some of the early subscriptions on the manuscripts. The themes on the letter that Paul is really going through is that actually the letter it's providing a really full explanation of the good news of the gospel. And he's really providing this letter and the explanation of it as a way of seeking unity within the church there, of helping them realize, you know, what's important. What is the foundation that they should build in themselves upon to enable a community that is diverse to be able to move forward together? And so it's split into 4 different sections, which you can follow fairly clearly, which you'll see in the Bible Project as well. So the first 4 chapters are talking about how the gospel reveals God's righteousness. And then the next 5, chapters 5 to 8, is about how the gospel creates a new humanity. 9 to 11 is how the gospel fulfills God's promise to Israel. And then 12 to 16 is about how the gospel unifies the church. And the key verse, and I always like this when I'm looking for sort of like the key verse, it really does capture a lot of this. And it comes from the start of his letter, where Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So here is kind of his, I guess, like his thesis statement, that he's going to be talking about the gospel, about the fact that the gospel's uniting Jew and Greek alike, that it's through the gospel that God's righteousness is revealed, and it's through the gospel that they are going to live by. And this is really the structure that Paul then goes on to develop in his letter, which we're going to be exploring a bit now. Well, what I found quite interesting is that Paul uses the characters of the Old Testament in a really amazing way to thread the story and to help the church there in Rome to understand the journey that God has led them in to this point where they're called to be united together. There's actually more quotes from the Hebrew scriptures in the Paul's letter to the Romans than any other of his letters. So clearly he's seeing this narrative that he's expounding in the letter as really important. And so I thought tonight, which is a little bit different to the Bible Project, that it would be quite interesting to just go through Romans, but we'll actually go through the Old Testament characters that Paul is highlighting. And hopefully you'll see how he's been developing these 4 different themes as we go through these characters. He says in chapter 15, "For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope." And so that's what we're going to be doing this evening, is we're going to be reading through and having that encouragement and that hope that Paul was expressing to the Romans church. If you have your Bibles, it would be quite good if you could turn to Romans chapter 4, because Romans chapter 4 is a piece that's well worth us spending a bit of time reading, and also it starts off this journey that Paul is taking the church on in this letter. So it's Romans chapter 4 verses 1 to 13, so it's a bit of a chunk, but it will be worth us spending a bit of time just reading through the scriptures together. So it says, "Abraham was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? If his good deeds had made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But this was not God's way. For the scriptures tell us Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. When people work, their wages are not a gift, but something they have earned. But people are counted as righteous not because of their work, but because of their faith in God, who forgives sinners. David also spoke of this when he described the happiness of those who are declared righteous without working for it. Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sins are put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those who record the Lord has cleared of sin. Now is this blessing only for the Jews, or is it also for uncircumcised Gentiles? Well, we have been saying that Abraham was counted as righteous by God because of his faith. But how did this happen? Was he counted as righteous only after he was circumcised? Or was it before he was circumcised? Clearly, God accepted Abraham before he was circumcised. Circumcision was a sign that Abraham already had faith and that God had already accepted him and declared him to be righteous, even before he was circumcised. So Abraham is the spiritual father of those who have faith but have not been circumcised. They are counted as righteous because of their faith. And Abraham is also the spiritual father of those who have been circumcised, but only if they have the same kind of faith Abraham had before he was circumcised. Clearly, God's promise to give the whole earth to Abraham and his descendants was based not on his obedience to God's law, but on a right relationship with God that comes by faith. Do you see how in that reading Paul's beginning to use the history to help frame what has happened for the church there to understand that actually it was by faith that these Old Testament characters, that they were right with God. Abraham believed, and righteousness was imputed by him by his faith, not by his works, not because he was circumcised. And then later Paul then refers to David and he confirms the same truth. For Paul, righteousness, which is quite a key word in this letter in Romans, it's a rich word that it describes God's character. It means that God is always just and right, and that God is faithful in fulfilling his promises. And the story of Jesus, which is where Paul is leading them to, it embodies these qualities. It shows how God's character of righteousness is consistent, how it endured even on the cross and fulfilled the promises which God had set out, even despite the odds that Jesus was facing. In chapter 5, following on this theme, Paul then uses Adam. And here it's unclear whether he's referring to Adam as the individual or Adam as humankind, because the name Adam, which literally means man or humankind, we can find that sometimes it can be used to more capture this sense of humanity. And Paul is talking about Adam, and he's talking to them about how it was through Adam that this problem of universal sin had come about. And all of this, again, was this failure to put their faith, to put trust in God. It was this failure to acknowledge God's lead within their lives. And so then he goes on and he uses a story of Isaac and Sarah. And he's using this example because Isaac is the child of promise. And he's illustrating this principle that the children of God are children of the promise that God had laid out. And this promise is only made possible through the divine grace of God through the new Adam, which is Jesus Christ. He highlights baptism as a really important sacred symbol of this idea of dying to the old Adam, the old humanity with the universal sin, and entering into this new life, into the new Adam, into Jesus. He says it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. And for those that were here last time, you can see a bit of the language as to why I find the whole idea of covenant promises very appealing when it comes about the idea of God's chosen people, because here Paul is definitely explaining about how God's promise, which is revealed in Jesus, was something which was called to be fulfilled in order that we might be able to enter into that. And in Jesus, those who are the children of the promise, they represent a new humanity. So from Jesus, where Adam in the past represents a humanity that failed to put their faith and trust in God to allow his faithful leading upon their lives, in Jesus, the new Adam, we have a new humanity. And then the amazing thing is that the Old Testament points to the fact that Jesus was ultimately this fulfillment of God's promises which he laid in Israel with Abraham. It says in chapter 10, it says, "For Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." And this word end, this is one of them words which can quite often be translated in different ways depending on the context. And it is kind of representing this idea of a culmination, of a fullness. Another word which is used by Paul more times in his letter than any of the other letters is the word kairos. And this is the sense of God's timing, of his divine and his perfect timing. And so Paul is again painting this picture. The story which has led them to this point is a story that God has had his hand in. And that all of this interaction that has been happening between all of these different characters with God and with Jesus, with each other, God has helped ensuring that will be fulfilled towards his promises. So Paul continues to recount the story. He recounts the history of the nation of Israel. And so he goes back to Abraham and he reminds them that just being a descendant of this great line, that doesn't necessarily automatically make a person a faithful member of the covenant community. And there's a real sort of like challenge there, because of course these Jewish people that were coming back to their church, there was as much resting on their bloodline, their hereditary, as they were on their faith in Jesus Christ. And so Paul recalls the story of Israel and the golden calf, as well as Pharaoh's rebellion. And he highlights that basing their relationship with God on following the commands of the law, that it is not enough. That they need to realize that the law points to Christ. However, he also covers that objection which you can imagine from that would be coming from some people, but we're God's chosen people. And he says, well, God has not completely and finally rejected Israel. He said that he allowed them to stumble, but only until the full number of the Gentiles will be brought to salvation. And Paul is saying that God had used their rejection of him, and he used that to continue his own purposes to spread the gospel into the Gentile world. And then he says, how is this represented? What is it that is the thing in all of these stories which is uniting both the Jews and the Gentiles? And he says it's to love each other. To love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honouring each other. You know, he's gone through the story and he's painted the picture and said, it's not based on following all of these commandments. Actually, God has demonstrated that the way that he fulfilled the promises to you is through love, is through enabling an opportunity for forgiveness, for those that have failed to honour God, to be faithful to him, to allow their calling to lead them in their lives. And Paul is saying that this same image of love and unity needs to be represented within the community. A community with rich diversity and differences, which Paul knows is going to lead to conflict. In many respects, it's not surprising that they're working through the issues that they're working through. But he's saying, but rather than being identified by your differences, which are causing conflict within the life of the community, instead, people should identify you by your love, which creates unity despite them differences. A love that respects each other's differences. And that's really his culminating point, and Paul's using that to take them on the journey. Can you see how he's weaved together the story of Christ, the story of the good news of the gospel, but it's also incredibly pastoral as well, because he's speaking that into the very situation that they're in, where they're trying to wrestle with how you can have people from so many different places to worship together. And then finally, I love at the end of his letter, he has like his whole section at the end where he just thanks all of these people that he's been enjoying his ministry with. And I love that list because it's so full of the fact that it wasn't just Paul, it was so many people that were all working together for the ministry of the Lord. And then particularly, which I just want to raise because this blew my mind when I first came across this, that Paul commends Phoebe, a key female leader in the church who brought this letter to the church. He greets many other co-workers, many of whom are female, and definitely seems to be not using exclusionary language to suggest that some had special positions because they were female than others. He even talks about Junia, who there's been a lot of debate about it, but I think it seems to suggest that she was prominent among the apostles. He's showing in that final letter at the end the diversity of the community that God has called together, and the fact that everyone has a part to play in it. So that's the overview of the letter. And then going deeper, you'll probably be pleased to know I'm not going to go too deep tonight, but I think, I hope you'll find it quite interesting, because it in chapter 10 of Romans, and you might want to turn it in your books because you might find it helpful to look at it, it raises one of them interesting sort of discussions of what happens to those who never hear the gospel. And it's not really Paul's point, but he is raising enough to provide a worthwhile sort of conversation around that. And from what Paul has written, there has largely been two dominant positions called inclusivism and exclusivism. And I'll probably say that differently each time I say it. But the inclusivist, these are the group who would suggest that there are some people who can be saved by Jesus Christ without knowing it. That they have some sort of faith in the Saviour, but they've not been able to name that individual is Jesus Christ. They've been redeemed by the work of Christ, but they haven't named him within their lives. Now, you can imagine that what we're talking about here is, what about the tribesman in the forest, the jungle, that has never had the opportunity to hear the gospel? What about them? And these people are saying that there are some that can be saved by Jesus and know him without knowing his name. And they base this often on this chapter in Romans 10. And so in Romans 10, verses 14 to 15 and verses 20, and you can see where they get this from. So how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they sent me? And then it says later in verse 20, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. And so this belief of inclusivism is really a belief in general revelation. That Jesus can be found if somebody is seeking him in the world. And quite often this can be appealed to the Old Testament characters in the Old Testament who also appear to have been saved, but they didn't know Jesus' name either. And what they're saying is actually what matters most is it's humans responding to the light, even if they cannot name it. And for many, this view, it's in line with their understanding of God's character. You know, they couldn't think of God basically offering any other opportunity. But as usual, there is the opposite view, and there'll be lots of nuance along the way. But the opposite one is called exclusivism. And this is saying actually no, that it's only by having faith in the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ that somebody is able to be saved. And they're using exactly the same passages, plus a few extra, from Romans we'll find. But they're saying that actually the general revelation, what we can discover about God through the world, is only enough to condemn somebody, not to save them. And so they might go to Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where it says, ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. And this idea of being without excuse you can find in other places in the New Testament as well. And so it's saying that people aren't guilty because they haven't heard the gospel. They're saying that they're guilty through the fact that they haven't honoured the Creator God. They haven't allowed him to be their lead on their life. And that guiltiness, that guilt is systemic. It's something which is in everybody, which means that nobody is without excuse. And any sort of like evidence that we might have from general revelation should only really be evidence of our rebellion to God. And so it's suggesting that this doesn't condemn the innocent who have never heard of him because they're not innocent, because no one is innocent. Because they say, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And you'll see that in that passage in Romans that we were looking at earlier, because if you just read a little bit further to what we read a couple of seconds ago, it says, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so they're suggesting that it actually puts the onus on us as Christians to be the bringer of God news into people's lives. So there's a chain of logic that's being followed, because they're saying, one, the only way to be saved is to call on Christ's name. And the only way to call on Christ's name is to believe the gospel. And the only way to believe the gospel is to hear the gospel. And the only way to hear the gospel is to be told the gospel. It says in chapter 3, 9 to 11, all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin, as it is written. There is no one who is righteous, not even one. There is no one who is understanding. There is no one who seeks God. Isn't that confusing? You know, you can actually make a strong case on either side, kind of similar to what Alistair was saying this morning in terms of different interpretations of Revelation in terms of what it's speaking into. And so I have no answer to that. I have my own opinions, but I actually think the case is strong on both sides. And so I thought I'll just go straight into the questions with that, because actually I think it's the questions when you explore this which maybe allows us to sort of like test where we think we would be leaning to. And I think this question is actually really important in this one. Does it matter if we do not understand fully how God reaches or doesn't reach the lost? Does that matter? If you're right, stopping the... So open up to anyone else. A little tip, some people would say it matters